Click the wrong thing.
Okay.
Let's try this again. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Lightforge. This is ADWCTA.
This is Merps, and man, I have to say the weather here in the Virginia DC area it is
Oh
quite
God.
good.
Wait, it's good? It must be so much worse than here. We have 100
Well, wait.
degrees in New York right now. It's 6 p.m. It's 100 degrees outside.
Oh yeah.
Is it not
Well,
100 degrees in DC? Is it cooler in DC? You're in a
uh,
swamp.
we are in a swamp. Let me see. Okay, it's 90 degrees, so
Oh wait, that's
it's
actually really nice compared to
yeah,
here.
it's not, and there's
Ah.
a slight breeze as well. I went outside for a short period of time today. Somewhat recommend it, for those of you who are listening to this. But yeah, the weather is nice. Although we are going to get blistering hot very soon, so
Okay,
perfect time to
good. Good.
stay indoors and
This is
play.
one of the reasons why I'm like down on DC is because the weather there in the summer is like horrible because it's like really humid and like really hot. But like that's what New York is right now, and apparently DC is nice.
No, it's quite nice. Yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't know if I were in New York. I wouldn't go out that much. I'm in DC right now. I don't go out that much, anyways. Doesn't really apply to me.
I haven't even stepped foot outside the door. I had people like deliver the food to me because it's so
If you
awful
guys,
outside.
if you guys don't know, Adult has gone like a period of like a 2 week span where he hasn't gone outside. Just he just like stays in, drinks his Coke Zero. He gets food delivered, and he like happily is under house arrest. Like that's his choice, you know. He just chooses that life, and that's
Some
us. Like
people are forcibly removed from society by society. Some people choose to do it themselves for the better of society. It's like a public service.
right, and Adukta is doing the public a public service by not exposing himself to everyone else out there in many
Uh,
ways, like the general exposure
okay.
and the or worse exposure.
Now that this is on record and public for the police to
Mhm,
find,
mhm.
let's talk about Hearthstone Arena and what's going on with the arena.
Sure, sure. All right, so look, we are in the very thick of Angora, right? Angora has been out for what seems to be forever, and we have a lot of stats at this point. So this is nothing new at all. But if you guys are not aware, basically the Chinese arena meta, right? They basically release reports every, I don't know if it's every week or every couple of weeks, but they track quite a lot, and you can sort of see the win rates for
Hmm.
everyone over there across the world in China, and consistently we've seen Paladin as their #1 win rate class, right? And this is overall for the entire server. So the latest report that has come out on the 10th, so about a week ago, right? About a week ago, it has Paladin at around 53% win rate, Rogue at around, just a little bit below that at like 52-ish, Mage at 51-ish, and those are the only three classes above 50%,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And it seems to if you take their stats, those three are sort of in a tier of its own. And then next you have like hunters and priests and shamans at
Mhm.
around the 46 to 48% win rate, around there. So for according to those stats, those would be tier 2. And of course, Warlock, Druid, low.
And this
And
is for all
warrior.
people, right? This is just all Chinese players.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
This is just a general tracking. And the warrior is like bottom.
Like really bottom, right? Like a 30% win rate.
Yeah, yeah. So very, very low. Although, it has risen in the past week, which is, someone made a post that says Warriors have risen dramatically. And by dramatically, it means like it's a little bit closer to
It's regressing
Druid.
to some kind of mean of like
Right,
35% instead of 30% or something like that. Probably maybe
Something
like
like
40% actually.
But
Um,
anyways, the important thing is sort of those are the rankings at large, right? And before we get to sort of the next part, Adukta, do you have any general comments on these stats?
Okay, so I think the next part is more interesting than this. I'll just let you go on to the next part because these have been pretty much what they are since the very beginning, right? Like Ungoro
Sure.
came out, and this is kind of what all the win rates were, and it's kind of stayed this way. It hasn't changed all that much, but like I think Shaman went down a bit just because I think people realize what Volcano does now. But that aside, everything's kind of where you expect it to be. No real surprises here.
Right. So, these are the stats from the public at large. During this past week, Dr. Stein, one of the mods for our channel, and more importantly, a very, very good arena player who was number 3 on EU during one of the leaderboards, compiled stats from streamers, streamers that you might recognize in the arena community. So to list them, he basically tracked Amaz, both of us, ADWCTA and Merps, Dreads, Isherwood, Crip. He tracked his own runs, and Shady Bunny, Hafu, 12 wins, or Victor. And he took all those stats together and sort of compiled and basically said, well, we have seen the general public's win rate, right? Let's see these streamer win rates. And I think it's safe to say that, like, if you combine all the streamer, you have a collection of sort of higher average players, right? Better players.
Good players, yeah. Like, this is a way to get good players' win rates.
Right. And you know what? At the end of the day, Paladin is still at the very top. And it is quite a huge difference. Paladin reigns supreme among the streamers with a 7.72 average, right? And number 2 is Mage with 7.23 average, and Rogue is like a little bit below with a 7.17. And these are the only 3 classes above 7 wins. So
that's crazy that only 3 classes are above 7 wins. It's usually like many more classes than that.
Right.
So we know we're in an uneven meta, but we're also in a time in which there's just more variance, and the good players are less able to get high win rates consistently. But also that's 0.5. That's a huge difference. And I push this a lot. Merps has pushed this too, and we generally believe that Paladin is one of the lower skill classes. It's not like Priest, right? Priest we really like. Priest is very low skilled, but Paladin is like kind of the next level up. And so we thought that when you took the stats of the best players, Paladin may drop a little, right? They may be like, tied with Mage or Rogue, or like a little below them or something, right? Not that they would be 0.5 above them. And I mean, my personal stats reflect that. Paladin's like my 5th best class or something like that. With not a terribly high sample size, but still, like, my personal experience with Paladin is that it's easy to whiff on a draft, not like totally whiff, but whiff enough that you're not going to do too well on it, and there's not a lot you can do as a player to really like change your fate, depending on your matchups, depending on what cards you end up drawing into your hand. So there's a lot of powerful cards, and maybe what it is that I just got unlucky with my drafts for like for like, if I just got 2 unlucky drafts and the rest were normal, that would significantly affect my win rate, right? Like, I just have such a low sample size. But meanwhile, I think you've been doing very well with Paladin. So
decently enough, yeah. So I guess the question is sort of like, what caused this? Because this is definitely a big enough sample size, right? Between all the streamers put together. So Dr. Stein has compiled, for Paladin, we have almost 200 runs. Exactly 199 runs with a 7.72 average. And this sort of blows away the next best average, which is Mage, right? Which we identify as a top class. I think everyone would identify as a top class. And Rogue, with 7.17. I think that makes sense. Like, I remember watching Shady Bunny stream, and he, while going for the leaderboard, he had a choice between Mage and Rogue, right? And he, at the end of the day, picked Mage. And when chat asked him why, he's just like, I think Rogue has better chance to go 12, but I think Mage has significantly less chance to whiff, right? Like, the standard deviation is
Rogue is always a little like a little more all in, right? Because you're hurting yourself, you're relying on fewer like power cards,
right? And this is when Shady was like 25 runs in, and I can understand. He's like, I will take the safe 8 wins rather than going for the 12 wins, but maybe only getting 4, right?
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. We see mages slightly ahead, but rogue is like right there with it. It's a difference of 0.1. But Paladin, even among the streamers, really, really high. And for the other classes, it's like, well, okay, for warriors, it is. If you guys are curious, warrior is bringing up the rear at 4.5 win.
This is for like the best players, by the way. Like, like maybe not like the best players, but like definitely every one of these streamers has hit like, top like 20 at some point, top 30.
To be fair, the try hardness of all the streamers and of all the runs will differ, right?
Right.
And I can see some of the warrior runs as being just like, if I'm picking warrior anyways, I'm going to have fun.
Have more fun with it, yeah.
Right. I'm going to pick the explorer.
But still, so what's the second lowest? Warriors at 4.3, you said?
Warriors at 4.53.
4.53, okay. Right. And the next lowest one is
Warlock,
at
which is at 6.07.
It's 1.5 wins. That's like literally like a plus 33% win rate for not picking warrior and picking the next worst class.
It's pretty bad. To be fair, if you look at the sample sizes involved, the most played class is mage, right? That's very fair with about 262 runs. And then you have, rogue with 231 runs. Paladin
how many with warrior?
38 runs.
Okay. Yeah.
I have happily contributed a very high percentage of those runs.
So that's really just you sucking with warrior, bring down.
I bring up the average.
Oh, you bring up the average.
No. My average is significantly better than that. So
do I bring up my average? Let me see if I bring up the average for warrior. I have had nope, I bring down the average. I definitely bring down the average.
But yes, so look, there's nothing new about the warrior stats. Something that you've talked about for a long time, that good players do better with druid, right? And druid is like it's right there. It's like, middle of the pack-ish with 6.5, right?
Yeah. Like of the bad classes, it does pretty well. It's like almost hunter level. It's above shaman. The surprise in here of the, besides paladin being so high, is that priest is actually, 1, above hunter, and 2, it's 6.77. And again, this is the same thing with paladin, I think, right? Which is that, like I said, I assume that people are, like, good players are better when they're not priests, because you get to do more, right? Priest is highly reactive. You're kind of just holding your, like, potion of madnesses and your whatever, just waiting for people to play into it. And when people do play into it, it's really freaking obvious, right? Like, when someone plays into a potion of madness, you're like, oh, I can do that now, right? Like, there's not too much thought to going in there. And on the other hand, you're trying to get on the board. It's not like a mystery, right? No matter what the situation is in the game, you're kind of trying to get on the board.
Right.
But
so just,
it turns out that...
Sorry, I just want to put this out there. I know a lot of people are just like, wait, what stats are you looking at? So Dr. Stein made these stats. I don't know if he posted it already, but he should be posting sort of the stats that we are looking at onto Reddit very soon. So you guys will be able to check it out for yourselves.
Yep. So yeah, what was I saying? Okay, so yeah, so what that means is either there are, and I do think there are ways of playing the priest and things that people do with priest that I'm not doing personally. Like I always, like since 7.1, priest has been like, I know my priest is below par, right? Like for my normal skill level with the other classes, but it seems like either that is related to the paladin thing, which is also why I'm not doing well with paladin, or the actual like average of the good cards and the good decks that you can make with these classes is so outpacing things. But if that were the case, you'd see everything reflected in global stats as well, right? If it's not like a mystery of like how to draft a good, paladin or priest. It's a little difficult actually. You have to worry about how to draft the curve. But the good cards are the good cards. You're not going to draft something besides the good cards. And they're both classes with extremely powerful cards. And a fair number of extremely powerful cards.
Yeah.
That kind of anchor the classes. So, I don't know. I'm going to, like, taking this data, I'm going to kind of go back into the drawing board and see if there's something that I am doing differently or drafting differently with Paladin and Priest that I could kind of make up for.
I think that's fair. So let me just ask it to you straight up. Do you think that you are wrong about the Paladin? Because, or that we have been wrong about the Paladin? Because we've always sort of still put them at like a slight tier below mages and rogue, right? So are you ready to change your mind?
No, I have a really crappy win rate with Paladin. I still don't know what the hell's going on with it. Like, I don't see why Paladin is doing so well. I beat Paladins very, very regularly. It's not like a huge problem, right? I'm not like, it's not like I see a Paladin, I'm like, oh no, it's a Paladin, right? I fear rogues much more. I've always feared rogues much more.
Okay.
Like, mages are similarly problematic to Paladins. I don't feel like Paladins are worse off than mages. And that's what we'll get into in Deep Fried Meta. We'll talk about how to beat a Paladin. But I don't know what is going on with the stats. Like, sure, we have like, well, how with Paladin? Paladin's like a 200 sample size. That's pretty big. But when you're going into like 3 digits, it's not that big. Like, I feel like it could regress more if we add more stats to it.
Especially your stats.
Especially my stats. You just like, if I just played the same number of runs as like, I don't know, let's say like Shady Bunny, then Paladin's gonna look a lot worse. Right? Like, these stats are still just a collection of streamers, and they're weighed by run, right? It's not like weighed by streamer, it's weighed by run. So I don't know who has maybe someone has like a really high Paladin win rate bringing this up. Maybe people are just getting a bit lucky. I haven't like totally changed my opinion, but it's enough for me to like start looking more at like how I draft Paladins. Is I try to have like 6 to 8 1 to 2 drops, or like things that are playable on 1 or 2 all together, and then just try to curve out on 3 and 4. 4 not even really, like you could do buffs and whatever and get away with that on 4, and then just have some of the big, like, you know, anchor cards. But the big anchor cards, you don't get to pick what you have because they're so good. You always pick them, right? Like, you're not going to pass up a Grime Street Protector or a Vine Cleaver or a Steed or a Dinos. You're just not going to pass up those cards ever. So it's entirely determined by how many of those cards you get, how powerful your deck is at the end. And you don't have a lot of choices in the mid-game to make a different type of Paladin. So you're kind of locked into the same archetype every time you draft a Paladin, and you're at the mercy of how many of those big like cards you get. Because if you don't have a lot of bombs, you're going to lose to every mage. They're just going to like out-control you. Like, you will play all of your big cards, you're not drawing a lot of cards, and then they will just slowly destroy all of your cards without dying, and then you will lose, right? Like, at some point, they play one taunt and you're screwed because you can't get through anymore. And there's mages everywhere in the meta, and rogues counter Paladins still, right? Like, really counter Paladins.
I totally agree that rogues counter Paladins, but I think these days Paladins have quite a good matchup against mage.
I think they do if they get the big cards. But if they don't get the big cards, they have a really bad matchup against mages. I think it's very polarized depending on what kind of deck you have.
Don't think it's the big cards that lead Paladins to victory against mage. I think it's the small cards, like the Lost in the Jungles and the Fireflies, the stuff that like sort of gets the snowball rolling, right? I think it's those cards that actually make it a very good matchup, because it's sort of, as soon as you have stuff on the board, as soon as something sticks, right, and you keep on having stuff continue to stick, that's either advantageous trades for you, or, you know, damage to the face. And mages have a lot of clears, but they don't have too many tempo like advantage clears, right? They have a lot of clears and a lot of
they have
like
freezes, which work really poorly for anything aggro. They have Volcanic Potion, which is a great tempo kind of player.
Volcanic Potion is quite good, yes. But freezes at the same time, you still have to deal with it, right? And they don't have like super cheap freezes. Like freezes, like the good freeze spells aren't exactly cheap, you know?
Right. But like what I don't know about that. Just because if you don't have your big anchors, yeah, you get on the board, yeah, you get some hits on the mage, but then you stall out. You don't do anything after a certain point. Once mage wipes you off the board at some point before dying, which they usually will, you have nothing to follow that up. You need like that Spike Ridge Steed that they can't hard remove. You need that Vine Cleaver, especially Vine Cleaver. Vine Cleaver is amazing against mage.
Yeah, Vine Cleaver, 12 damage to the face.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yes. But like, if you don't get those cards, or if you don't draw those cards, what are you doing as Paladin? You are like alive and kicking for a while, and then you're dead and doing nothing because you can't get through any taunts.
Well, I do agree that you need to draw those cards, right?
Well, okay, but if you agree that you need to draw those cards, then you need to draft those cards. And if you need to draft those cards, then you need those cards. And so what I'm saying is a paladin with very few to little of those cards won't do well against a mage.
See, so here's the thing. And I think it speaks to sort of the overall win rates, right? And you said you were surprised. You're just like, well, these all seem kind of like low, right? So your point that you need to draft the cards and you need to draw the cards, that's kind of true for every single class now, just because of the overall power of the cards and the decks that you're facing, right? So as a mage, like, you know, can you go like that high if you not only don't draft the meteors, don't draw the meteors, you
can. That's why, like, you were talking before about Shady Bunny taking mage over rogue. It's because of exactly that. It's because you don't actually need all those cards.
Well, no, that's a deviation.
Yeah,
that's a deviation.
That's what you were talking about, right? You're not talking about deviation?
No. It's not just like deviation. Like, because it's just about like your deck quality as well, right? Like, basically, you still need those good cards.
No, but you're literally talking about deviation right now. You're talking about the chances to get a lot of good cards or not a lot of good cards and how that affects your win rate. That's deviation.
No, you can talk about deviation, or you can just talk about like quality. I'm not talking about like your chances of like getting a killer deck versus like you know, a 10% deck versus like a 90% deck, right? It's just the overall card quality. Like, the overall card quality is so freaking high nowadays that, you know, you saying sort of like you can't win without these cards. Yeah, you can't win without the cards because everyone has really freaking good cards.
But that's deviation. We're talking about the deviation in which you need to actually secure like an 8-win deck, right? Because if you're talking about something like, can you win up to source? We're not talking about 12-win decks anymore, right? We're talking about like 8-win decks. Because we're talking about what it takes to get to these kinds of like these kind of averages that people need, right? Like Paladin is 7.7, Mage is 7.3. So what do you need to get like a 7.5 deck, right? Mages have much higher percentage chance to get a 7.5 deck than a Paladin, definitely. So I don't think it's every single class is like a Paladin and they're reliant on their draft in the same way. I think there are classes, Mages being probably the best example, always has been the best example of not needing cards. And and even Rogues are better. Like almost any class is better than Paladin and not needing cards, except like the really bad classes. Like Paladin is the only good class that relies on good cards.
So we actually have stats for sort of the breakdown, right? The percentage of runs that go like 7 wins, 8 wins, 9 wins, 10 wins, 12 wins, right, etc. So if we, for example, compare the Mage and Paladin,
but it doesn't say anything about deck quality. It doesn't say anything about if the Paladins are getting those big heavy cards or not.
Sure, but now we're just talking about averages, right? Like this is across 200 runs and across like
right. But you can't make the circular argument that Paladins are better because they have a higher win rate when you're looking at a stat set that everyone agrees Paladins have a higher win rate. What I'm talking about is for Paladins to win, you still need those high impact large cards that kick in at 6 mana earliest for Spike Ridge Steed, but usually around 7 mana and then 8 mana for Dino Size. Like, you're trying to make some argument that Paladins can win some of its matchups against, you know, like Mage specifically, without those cards.
According to your argument, then Paladins should have not only a higher percentage of like 11 and 12s, but also a higher percentage of the low wins compared to Mages, right? So they would have the more of the 2 wins, 3 wins, 4 wins, but at the same time, they'd have like a lot more of the 10, 11, and 12s, right?
Yeah. I think that's right.
Right.
And I'm looking at the stats. 12 win for Mage is 13%. 12 win for Paladin is 24%. So that seems like it's really backing that up. And
but the lower wins, Paladin is not like bombing. They're doing quite well.
What do you count as lower wins?
So let's just compare them 1-to-1, right? So for 0 wins, Paladin is 1%, Mage is 0.4%, right? This is like 1 run compared to 2 runs.
So as soon as you hit, so as soon as you hit 3 wins, Mage overtakes Paladin. Like when you sum everything up, as soon as you hit 3 wins. So if you're counting only 0, 1, and 2 wins, like total whiffs, then yes, Paladin has, and these are terribly low sample sizes, by the way, right? Like these are like 10 win sample size, like 10 run sample sizes. But as soon as you get, for 0, 1, and 2 added together, you have 11 Paladin runs tracked here and 13 Mage runs tracked here, right? Like that's horribly low. But once you add 3 wins, you now have like you immediately like triple your sample size, or at least double your sample size, 2.5 times your sample size. And when that kicks in, Mage becomes more stable. Like even after adding in the 0, 1, and 2 wins, and Mage remains more stable for the entire rest of the wins. So if you're judging on a class as stabilizing around 7.5, which is the win rate that you expect, you know, these good players to get, then Mage is much more stable. Mage may whiff a tiny bit more frequently at the very bottom, but even at 3 wins per run, which is like you know, we usually say 5 wins per run is like the bottom. Like any deck can get to 5 wins per run in the hands of a good player. So 3 is a pretty low bar to start at, and even at 3, Mage is more stable. And we already know that Paladins spike higher.
So Mage gets...
Mage at 3 wins gets 8% plus 2.67%.
But you don't want that. That's like a whiff. Like you don't want that number to be high. Like you don't want that. Like for Mage, you don't want 3 wins to be 8%. You want it to be the Paladin's 4.5%.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean.
Yeah?
Okay,
like
yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay. So mages have a higher percent chance of whiffing, is what you're saying. To get below like 5 wins or below.
Yes.
Okay. That's fair. That's fair.
Right? So it's and look, like I totally understand your main point. Like this is not the be all end all, right? There are certainly other factors involved. But I think you know, like this sort of detail.
But I think it's also like if you're going for like if you're just looking at something that gets 5 wins per run, at some point you're going to be like 3-2 or something, right? Like if you're going for like a 3 or 4 win run, you're going to be 3-2 or something. And what you're doing is you're not facing mages at that point, right? You're not facing rogues. So I think what's happening here to even the Paladins like win rates out at the bottom is that you just see a lot less of the Paladins' bad matchups. Of the matchups in which the Paladin needs those big giant cards to win.
But I mean, at the same time, that's fine, right? You know, that's not really like enough.
Sure, but I'm going back to my point that this is why it's like unstable at the higher at the like the normal end that you want to be looking at that you're targeting. Let's say, because like, if you still need those large cards, what you're looking at here is the percent chance a Paladin is going to beat a Warlock. Or a warrior, or some of those, right? And those classes all have horrible times dealing with Paladin. They've always had horrible times dealing with Paladin, right? Like, because, you know, Paladins counter Shamans, they counter Priests, they counter Warlocks to a certain degree. They do just fine against, you know, your Hunters. Warriors, I don't even know what Warriors are good at these days besides Hunters. But, like, the whole low end of the spectrum, Paladins are pretty damn good at. Like, Druid aside, Paladins have a decisive edge against all those other classes. So when the win rates get so low, I can see that the Paladins even itself out a little, right? Because the mages are no longer there in large numbers, the rogues are no longer there. But once you get to that middle zone, the mages start taking over the stability. And for the Paladins, you start needing those big cards. And not having those big cards start really hurting. So I guess if you're looking at like average win rates, like if your argument is Paladins have higher average win rates, and then you look at the stats that say that Paladins have higher win rates. No matter how you cut it, Paladins are going to have higher win rates, right? Like that's not it's like a circular kind of thing. So what I'm saying is you're still less in control of your win rate. What I'm saying is you still need those cards. Your impact seems like it's going to be less. Like that's the point I'm trying to make, or at least it feels that way to me. Like when you don't get your decks
because. All the numbers are lower in the range that you're saying, like the 7, 8, because they're shifted to 12. It's not because they're taken from the middle and shifted to both the very bottom and the top. You're just taking the numbers in the middle and purely shifting it to the very top.
So you're saying like and that's okay.
Like,
I mean, that's not entirely
that's the point
true.
I'm trying to make.
That's not
but,
that's
yeah.
not entirely true. Some of the middle is lost around the 6 to 8 win area compared to the
Sure.
mage.
But,
Even if you're boosting the other ones up, there's 10%, 3% is covered by 11, 1.5% is covered by 10, and then 5% is covered by 9. So the 8, 7, 6 win area, or not even 6, just the 7 and 8 win area, mage is still more stable in.
Yeah, and that's fine. But like I wanted to point this out, and we've gone on this for long enough, but just to point out that it's not as if Paladin is sort of taking the middle wins and evenly distributing it among the very bottom and the very top. Right. So, anyways, do you want to move on to the actual thing we want to talk about, like beating Paladins?
Okay, so let's talk about how to beat Paladins, because it's not the hardest thing to beat Paladins. This is why I'm still like, I'm not sold on Paladins being the best class. I think I'm more sold that Paladins are more even with rogues and mages than what I had been saying. But I mean, I have no experience with this though. Like, whenever I play a Paladin, the chances to whiff seems really high to me. And it could just be I've been getting unlucky drafts. But when you don't get the cards, you can't do anything. There's nothing. You feel so helpless as Paladin. It's very priest-like in this meta. When you're a Paladin and you don't have those big anchor cards, or when you're a Paladin and you don't have those like early curve cards. So it's actually like a really difficult like drafting thing in my opinion. But I may just be whiffing. It may be really easy to draft 1/2 drops at low priority. And you may be like, actually offered like 4 or 5 of those large cards, and I'm only offered 1 or 2. So maybe that's just what it is. But when it comes to beating Paladins, I don't think it's actually that hard to beat a Paladin when you are a mage or a rogue or a druid.
Yeah. So do you want to start? Do you have a checklist?
I don't have a checklist, but I want to start with how Paladins are usually beat, right? Sure. Paladins in this meta have a lot of power cards, but most of their power cards involve having stuff on the board. So Grimestreet Protector, stuff on the board. You have Dino Size, stuff on the board. You have Spiker Steed, stuff on the board. And then there's the old school ones, like the Portal, stuff on the board, Blessing of Kings, stuff on the board. They're all, like, your main job as the other class is still to clear the Paladin off the board. And this gets annoying whenever Paladins start generating tokens and you don't have a ping, right? And Paladins have a hero power that'll always give it a token that it can buff. And Spiker Steed is enough to make even that token pretty scary, right? Like a 3/7 is nothing to like laugh at with taunt.
It's pretty dumb how a super valid turn 8 play is hero power Spiker Steed, right? Mm-hmm. And it's fantastic. Mm-hmm. You get a 3/7 that with a death rattle of a 3/7 taunt with a death rattle of 2/6 taunt.
Yep.
That's
totally legit for 8 mana, 1 card too. Yep. Whereas if you look at something like Blessing of Kings, for example, a turn 6 Blessing of Kings on a hero power is awful. That's 6 mana for a 5/5.
Right.
Like, it's just the Spiker Steed like Valley thing doesn't even compare to that. So anyway, your job is always to clear the Paladin off the board until you have a read that they have absolutely no buffs. And then when they have absolutely no buffs, you kind of need to go for their face. So you have to make this switch, right? When they have the potential to buff anything, you need to play very, very conservatively. Because Paladins, like 2 of the big Paladin cards, which is Spiker's Steed and Grimestreet Protector, taunt. And they're giant taunts. They're like ridiculously big taunts that you're not going to be able to get through. So if you leave anything on the board, you can't finish the Paladin. Like, you need to actually have like direct damage reach to be able to go to the face of the Paladin without a read that they don't have these buffs.
Yeah.
But once you have that read that they don't have those buffs, you can't keep removing the Paladin. Because if you try to keep removing the Paladin, unless you have like an insane advantage, like you need like a 3-card advantage with full control of the board. Because if you don't have full control of the board, the Paladin can flip the board and then build off the board with more buffs and whatever, right? And then you could lose. And if you don't have the card advantage, you could eventually just get out card advantage if the Paladin has a bigger deck. So you do need to hit the face at some point. And the point is when you have that read that they don't have a buff. So the way to beat the Paladin that I found a lot of success with, and this is also why rogue and mages are what does it for paladin, because whenever they hero power, starting at whatever turn that they normally can start adding hero powers in for very little like cost, you can hero power right back. Because if you can't remove that, in order to deny the buff, you need an extra minion on the board. And while paladins don't punish extra minions on the board that hard, they still have these consecration cards. Primordial Drake is still a card. Like, all these, like, flip the board cards really punish having an additional small thing on the board. So you need to put, like, a 2-3 on the board. But you may not have a 2-3, because 2-3s kind of suck, like, overall. So it's actually, it puts you in a really awkward spot where you don't have that extra ping.
Yep.
Like, that's the reason that the extra ping is good. But otherwise, you just keep the paladin off the board. They don't have a good way to really build on it, right? Their power turns turn 4 when it comes to all the buffs and the swords. And if you survive that, which you should if you're, like, at all not a control deck, then they can't build. And when they can't build, they just have a bunch of cards in their hands that don't do anything, and you will eventually win.
Right. So I have a very, I guess, specific advice, and this is something that I have noticed quite often. And if I remind myself of this, it usually leads to more victories against paladins, which is exploit the paladins turn 3 and turn 5, because those are typically the weakest turns for paladin, right? Turn 1 is sort of, you know, like you either play something or you don't. It's sort of like turn 1 is almost like the freebie turn, right? Where and if they get lost in the jungle, you are far behind, and that's unfortunate. But turn 2, that's sort of the equalizing play. That's when the game starts. Turn 3 is when, and I've noticed this as well, like I still have this innate fear from turn 3, because historically it's like, oh god, muster, or oh god, CO chance.
It's nothing.
Right?
It's just a rallying blade now. It's just a rallying blade.
Right. And look, is Rallying Blade going to give value against you? Yeah, it is. But what are you going to do, right?
It's one card. It has no offering bonus. It's not a spell. Like, your Paladin is not likely to have it.
So really exploit turn 3. And the fact that on turn 3, a Paladin is very vulnerable. You know, they don't have the buff, right? They don't have, like, the super duper plays that really get them ahead. Like, can they play Argent Protector on turn 3? Sure. They still hang 1 mana, probably. And at the same time, you know, they are...
and if you look at Argent Protector, for example, it's not that good if it costs 3 mana.
No, it's not that great.
So it's just like they took a great card and they made it an okay card.
Right. And obviously, you know, protect yourself. See how your deck plays. If you're like a priest, and you know, it's like a 3-2 versus a 3-2 or something, don't just be like, Merps told me to like take all the risks, go face. It's like, no, if you're a priest and you're not going face anyway, just trade. But if you have a way to sort of try to get ahead, right, make a riskier play, and sort of capitalize, do it going into the Paladin's turn 3, do it going into the Paladin's turn 5, because the Paladin has very few ways to punish you during those turns. And those are like the weak points. And you have to capitalize on the weak points, because a lot of times you are giving up your maximum tempo play on turn 4 and on turn 6, right? Because of the fear of, you know, a Consecration or Blessed Kings. And on turn 6, you know, it's the Boogeyman, Spike Ridge Steed, and sometimes you just got to clear their stuff. You got to play a little bit more inefficiently. So how do you sort of, and if you're playing inefficiently on turn 3 and on turn 5 as well, you lose the game.
Yeah,
so
you start falling really far behind.
Right. So make those, you know, swingy, big tempo plays during those turns, and then you could bring it back a little bit on turn 4 and turn 6.
Definitely. And keep in mind, the Paladins, like Merp said, right? The Paladins have no real way of getting onto the board in these early turns. So if you have like a deck that curves out at all, you should be the one on the board. Like, you should always be playing Deny the Paladin, because you have a better starting position than the Paladin. And if you're playing a control kind of deck, then the Paladin is going to get its value, but hopefully you will have more value, right? That's always what the control game is. You will always try to have more value. And the Paladin does not have any initiative, so by being on the board, the Paladin hasn't gotten the better of you. The Paladin has equaled you if you are a real control deck, right? Like, now you are on an even playing ground with the Paladin. So one thing that I emphasize is getting the read that your Paladin doesn't have a buff, right?
Sure.
The easiest way to get that read is whenever they play like a Smuggler's Run or something and they have all minions. Because then it's just Protector. That's the only card, and it's an annoying card, and I lose I want to say, like, the percentage of games against Paladin that I lose to Vine Cleaver or Protector is more than half of all my Paladin losses.
Vine Cleaver is just way too good.
Yeah,
that card,
because that punishes your face. That's 12 damage to your face that you like, and it drops stuff, so you can't even reverse punish your opponent, right? Like, one of the easiest ways to win if your opponent starts using a weapon to your face is put up a taunt and throw your guys to your opponent's face. But now they have these 1/1s that if you don't clear, they're gonna buff, and they're gonna buff with the taunt, and you're not gonna get through.
The amount of damage that the 1/1s either soak up, like, or they get to your opponent's face is ridiculous. Yeah. And because Vine Cleaver is so backbreaking because it's not only initiative, but your opponent has been playing around Spikeridge Steed for 2 turns, and it has taken a toll on them, probably, right? It takes a toll on me whenever I'm just like, man, can I play around Spikeridge Steed? Probably. I'm going to be making some sacrifices. Hopefully I get there. And then they Vine Cleaver on turn 7. I'm just like, now it's also about dino size. And dino size is even more backbreaking.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Because dinosaur ends the game in 2 turns.
Right. So now I'm just thinking like, oh, now I'm even more incentivized to like kill his 1/1s.
And you have to, and then you don't get face damage in. And those are all, like, even if he has those cards and he doesn't play them, like, even if you do manage to prevent him from having the board, he still has a 10/10, like, in his hand, just, like, for value. And he has 12 damage, plus, like, a whole bunch of 1/1s from that Vine Cleaver. Like, he basically, with those 2 cards, has, like, 4 or 5 cards of value, even if he doesn't get to play any on, like, good targets. So, like, in a worst-case scenario, when you're completely denying him the board, he has insane card advantage still. But okay, so the idea is, because those cards are so backbreaking, what you need to do is when you're in control of the situation, you need to find a way to get the read, right? Because if you don't have the reads, you're in a very bad position. So rather than continuing to put yourself in the bad position, whether he has these cards or not have these cards, you want to do stuff which will put you in a slightly worse position, but then potentially give you the read so you can actually win the game. So what you want to do is let out a little bit of pressure here and there. Like, give him a turn in which he can Spikeridge Steed. Give him a turn in which he can Dino Size. And make sure that if he plays, because those cards take up their entire mana for the turn. Like, the Paladin's not doing anything else if they're playing those cards. So you can set things up so that they could play that card, but then either you have an immediate response or it doesn't punish your board. Like, especially Spikeridge Steed, right? It only has 3 attack and its next body only has 2 attack. So if you have a bunch of, like, big stuff on the board, you may just say, okay, go ahead, Spikeridge Steed. Like, I'm letting the Spikeridge Steed out right now because I can destroy it fairly efficiently and then rebuild. Or, if you only have small things on the board, and you have, like, a sap or, like, a polymorph or something in your hand, you could be like, yes, please buff this minion right now. Like, I want to be able to polymorph and then just win the game by being so far ahead on tempo after that. So you want to set up situations, like, you need to bait the Paladin.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't take... So the way to... like, yes, if you bait the Paladin and then you have a read and then the Paladin, like, didn't take the bait, you lose because then you're starting to play into his really powerful cards. But that happens really, really infrequently. Paladins are going to take the bait because these large cards are stuck in their hand. Like, especially if they have multiple copies of it. They need to get the cards out at some point. And so when they have initiative on that card, they're very heavily incentivized to play that card. Even if they feel like they may be playing into a trap or they're not getting the best value out of it, it's still a better value than Hero Power Spikeridge Steed. And they're going to take that value. So that's how you get your read, and that's how you punish them for being forced to play these cards. Like, there's a reason these cards are, like, broken, but not, like, so broken, right? Like, I don't know where we have Spikeridge Steed, but it's, like, in, like, the 150s area or something, which is insanely powerful. But it's not, like, Pyros. Like, you don't just win the card advantage war right off the bat with this card.
I love how you had to bring in the Pyros, man.
Pyros is so good. I remember when my Pyros got mind controlled and I lost. Okay. But yeah, so that's how you beat the Paladin. You have your general game plan, and then you push for your reads. You create these areas where you can let out a little bit of pressure without losing the board. Because you're against the Paladin, you care about the board. You need to have the board against the Paladin. So you let out the pressure at appropriate intervals so that you don't lose. They use up their big cards. you win, right? Like that's it has to be a game plan, right? Like you need a game plan against a paladin. You can't just like play your cards and then win. That doesn't happen as often as you'd like it to.
And I mean, even if you have a game plan, sort of like what makes Paladin have such a high win rate? It's because, you know, you can try implementing all these things as ADWCTA says, but you can, like, if you really think about it, all of these steps are just like, it's hard, right? It's hard to get yourself in this position. It's like, oh yeah, it's like, it's
Step
okay.
1, have the board. Step 2, have polymorph, right? Like,
right. And otherwise, the position that a lot of you will find yourselves in, just statistically, right? Like, because you won't have the answer so very often, you are going to go into the later turns and just be like, okay, the risk analysis is, can I afford to take a Spikered Steed or the Dino Size, right? Sometimes it's yes, like maybe, right? And then you're in that awkward position. It's like, I don't know, I might just get out that, like, if I don't put pressure on and this game goes on for too much longer, there will come a turn in which I can't do anything and he sees and I loses, right?
Nope.
But then it's like, if I go face and he sees, I definitely lose, like 110%. So that's, you know, the power of the Paladin. But just make sure you do these risk assessments. And if you do have the luxury and the ability to just let them steed and then, you know, you take care of it, that's, you know, you definitely do that. And I think that's
like, save all hard removals and silences for these buffs. Just save all of them. Don't ever use them for tempo. I lost a game because I didn't use a silence for tempo against the Paladin. No regrets. Like, no regrets. I was saving it. He had 4 cards in his hand. I was saving it for some kind of buff.
Yeah, and that's fine. And I had a game where I saved it, and I was like, oh man, I got a, you know, user for the Steed or the Dino Size. Ended up only using it on a Tyrion, so, you know, I thought that was fine. But yeah, like, silences are quite good against Paladins nowadays. So that's sort of the advice to beat them. You know, like, capitalize on your turn 3, turn 5. The advice that ADWCTA said. And we're not saying this is easy, right? No. It's not like, oh man, I can beat all the Paladins now. No, they're still gonna destroy you some games.
But it's an actual game plan you can have, right? Like, we talked about beating mages quite frequently, which is that you kind of have to, like, push them, like, pretty early on. This is not what you need to do with Paladin. Like, if you have the same game plan against a mage as a Paladin, bad, very bad. You have to treat them as different, like, classes that you're facing. And you have to exploit each of their weaknesses. And I think because Paladin is so specific on specific cards that punish you, like, the way you deal with it gets much more specific. And so people without, like, an actual, like, step-by-step game plan to beat the Paladin get kind of, like, lost a little in the end when they're like, what do I do? Am I just kind of, like, at the mercy of the Paladin? You kind of are, but you're also kind of not really at the mercy of the Paladin. Like, if you're a Paladin player, I'm sure you've often felt like you were at the mercy of your opponent. Because that is the case. If your opponent knows what they're doing, or if your opponent has the right cards, you can't do much as the Paladin, right? That's why I always hate on the Paladin for it. Okay, question from the GOAT. What's up?
Question from the GOAT. This week has been submitted by one of our Twitter followers. It's Ran Dragon Tweets. Thank you so much, Ran Dragon Tweets. They ask, I have a question for this week. I struggle at the first games of a deck. How do I figure out how my deck plays out before the start? It's a great question.
That's
it's
something
really
good question.
That ADWCTA and I both do, right? After we draft, we don't just, like, jump into the game. We look at it and we evaluate. ADWCTA, what's your sort of process?
I'll say I have I'll lay out my process after this, but I'll also say that I'm not the best at doing this just by results, because I think compared to other streamers that I've watched, I recover much more, and it also means I go down low much more. Like, 12-0 runs are not very common for me, even if 12-2 runs are, like, much, like, you know, they make up for my lack of 12-0 runs. But it means that there's a lot of times in which it actually takes me, like, losing a game or even 2 games before I'm like, oh, that's how this deck works. Like, why did I lose that game? It's because I played this wrong, and like the speed that I'm going at isn't the right one.
By the way, guys, there's nothing admirable about this. It's not what you want to do.
No, it's not. It's just
no
like
trophy for doing this.
No, it's just I'm just not like actually interpreting the decks necessarily at the correct speed. But the way I evaluate this, and again, you can only do this when you're about to lose, or like when you luck out into a win and you're like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have won that. That was like a little too close, even though I had an advantage. Is if you're playing a curve out and slightly more aggressive deck, what you want to make sure you do is you want to take your opponent down to 0 at around the same time that you run out of cards. Like, you want to keep using up all your mana, and then the turn in which you start top decking, you want to win. Like, that's the correct speed to be playing at. So measure that, get a feel for it, and if you hit it, great. If you find yourself winning with still cards in your hand, that means you're pushing a little too fast. And if you find yourself winning like after 4 turns of top decking, that means you should play a little bit slower, right? Especially because we're playing Hunter today. Like, that's when you need to start throwing in hero powers earlier to make your cards more valuable. That's for aggression. When you're playing control, what you want to do is measure the reverse, which is how quickly you lose the board without being able to recover. Because you're always faced with these decisions when you're playing control, which is you should tempo first, but you still need to get a card advantage over your opponent somehow. So if you see yourself falling behind by him having 1 or 2 minions on the board without you having a response, you have done something like poorly, right? Like, he can have 1 minion on the board and you don't have a response, that's okay. But if he has like 2 minions, and you don't have a response, that means at some point earlier, if you had a choice to do something different, you should have tempoed out more. And these are just points in which it'll help you learn, like in game, when you're doing the right thing and the wrong thing. In terms of how to figure this out before the actual match, the first match starts, I like to count in my head like number of big cards I have, and then subtract out number of dead cards I have. So if a card's like Innervate, that's not a real card, right? And if a card is like more than 5/5, I count it as a quote-unquote big card. And if I have 10 big cards, I have a normal size deck. If I have less than 10 big cards, I have a small size deck. That number, by the way, used to be 6 before Un'Goro. Like, before 7.1 Un'Goro. That number used to be 6. It's 10 now. Like, I feel like the average size, like, number of big cards you have in your deck is 10. And a big card isn't just, like, mana cost. It's like, the amount of card advantage you have. So any card draw card is a big card. Any card that discovers is a big card, because you're going to try to discover the bigger of the thing. And then anything that's like a 5/6 or above, right? That's also a big card. So that's what I kind of look at, and that'll give you a rough idea of the size of your deck and how far you can go. These are all like macro concepts, right? And that's how I start off like judging my deck. You wanna add to that, or like add in some of the more micro concerns?
Yeah, definitely. So when I look at the deck, I actually focus on, I guess what you would define as the micro stuff, right? And specifically the mulligan. I think that's really the time in which I figure out the mulligan. So you can add up to what he described. You're focusing on sort of just it's like, how does my deck play out generally? Right. Yep. And like the big picture goals and stuff. I think for me, even as I'm drafting, I'm thinking of that. And by the time I'm done drafting, I've already thought of that. I've already considered that, because I sort of start asking myself those questions at like pick 25, 26. So at the end, I've already kind of figured it out. What I personally do an in-depth analysis at the end is it's at the very beginning, it's just a simple numbers game. I count my 1s, I count my 2s, I count my 3s, and I try to figure out sort of what I want to be mulliganing for, right? Specific questions include, do I keep 3 drops, right? I think that's an important question that that you should ask yourself for the deck. And also, how many 1s do I have to sort of figure out, like, well, should I go for the 1s, right? Like, should I go for the 1s at all? Or do I, like, if I have a 2 and a 3, do I just keep that? Like, or should I just keep the 2 and be more aggressive for 1s? Because I think the mulligan, it's quite an underrated factor, right? It impacts your win rate, I think, quite significantly, but people sort of don't give it the credit that it deserves. So for me, it's a good time to sort of figure out what's my plan going into the mulligan with the coin or without the coin. And look, guys, you don't have to be like super scientific about this, but just knowing those numbers, number of 1 drops, number of 2 drops, number of 3 drops, that helps me out a lot. So that's one of the micro things that I consider. And I would think that's
if you want a specific number, usually if I have 6 1/2 drops, I'll go for the 2 drop. And if I don't, I'll just keep my 3 and be happy with it. Like that's what I usually do. And
that's fair.
And depending on how many 3s you have, if you have the coin, you may just keep a 3 regardless. Like if you have enough 3s that you can like consistently get another one, or if you have like a 1 and a 3 already in your hand and you're just going for the other 3.
Right. So anyways, that's sort of what I'm looking for, and hopefully that answers your question, Rain Dragon. But thanks for submitting the question this week.
Yeah, question from the GOAT, brought to you by our patrons. Even though anyone can ask us a question, send your questions through Twitter, through our subreddit, Grinning Goat, or any of the other ways you can contact us. And then we'll discuss it on the next Lightforge. Our patrons are how this Lightforge podcast stays fed. I'm mixing my metaphors between the Lightforge and the goat, but it's patreon.com/grinninggoat. Thank you guys so much for supporting us. And let's end this on card good bad. This is your card good bad because we've already done Doomsayer. Like this was like episode 2 or something. Like this is a very early.
An eternity ago.
It was like a year and a half ago.
Doomsayer is. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
Yeah, so I was about to say. So we're going back to Doomsayer not because the card has really changed, but because the card acts kind of differently in every meta, and we haven't done Doomsayer since 7.1 came out. And that actually makes a pretty big difference. And we've recently raised the score of Doomsayer significantly from like, I think 79 to 90. And Merps will tell you why this is the best card ever.
I love Doomsayer. Oh my god, it's so good. And it was... I recognized the goodness of Doomsayer about a month ago, and then I had to convince you. Right.
You had to convince yourself. I was always like, how high do you want Doomsayer? Because that was always your, like, you always play more
on the terms. And then afterwards, I remember in quite a few drafts, like, so there was one in which I drafted, and I think you were like, backseat gaming, right? And you were a little bit surprised at it. And then it came to co-op between us, in which I ditched you, but I graced you. I was like, Doomsayer. And this is one of those cards that it just does so much, right? It just does so freaking much. Like we talked about how to beat Paladins, Doomsayer beats Paladins. Like it just dominates Paladins. It's so crazy. Denies them the board, and typically they can't, do much against it. And a Paladin that doesn't have the board is a dead Paladin. But I found Doomsayer to just be so freaking good because with the removal of sort of like from wild to standard, you don't have like the crazy early game turns anymore, right? And it's a change that we don't think. It's like you don't see the zombie chow into Shield of Minibot anymore, right? And then you play they play zombie chow, and then you pass. They play Shield of Minibot, and then you play your Doomsayer, and then they seal champs, and suddenly you're just like, oh, this game is taking a really bad turn.
It is over now when they have a 5/3 Divine Shield and a 2/2 Divine Shield, and you have nothing.
Right. And right now, these days, like you said, a lot of the power has evened out through the deck, right? It's like, you have your nesting rocks, or in your case, nesting row. You have your primordial drakes, and you have your steeds, you have your meteors, and you have all these great cards, and the quality of the deck is super high. But it's not like earlier on when a higher percentage of your quality was in your low cards, right? And that was where the power was. So if you're able to drop that Doomsayer on turn 2 or turn 3,
they can't do anything about it.
They very rarely can do anything about it, or they actually have to spend a spell on it and give it credit, right?
Because remember, it's a 2-mana card, right? Like if they give it credit, you win. You've done more. This Doomsayer has done more than its job, but they waste a spell on it. And most spells doesn't even do anything to it, right? Like it has 7 health. That's a whole ton of health. And so it'll kill like a card or two most of the time. But what I love most about Doomsayer in this meta is that even though it is a spell meta, you can play this in the late game quite effectively. Like, I was surprised. Like, obviously, Doomsayer in the early game is pretty good, right? Because if you think about what it does, it destroys whatever your opponent have, which is probably just one minion. So you're trading 1 for 1. But then it prevents your opponent from doing anything on their turn. So it also eats up like 3 of their mana, which is insane, right? Like, you've drained 3 of their mana. That's like 1.5 innervates for free on this card.
And it's got 7 health.
Yeah.
That's a ton of health.
Yeah, like, it's not getting removed very easily. But what I found really interesting in this meta is that you can play it in the late game very effectively. If your opponent plays a Nesting Row, for example, and you play a Doomsayer, even if you just play a Doomsayer, like, he can't do anything about it. He needs 2 more damage somehow. And if he doesn't have 2 more damage...
3 more damage.
Oh, yeah, he needs 3 more damage. So if he can, like, if he burns a spell on it, good, fine, right? If he doesn't burn a spell on it, he's going to lose his Nesting Row, which is like a 5 mana card, and that's a pretty good trade. And he also drains all of his mana again, right? And this time it's draining like 6 of his mana. So it's like an insane value at this point with the Doomsayer. Like, when you go later in the game, you're a little less secure with the Doomsayer, but you're rolling higher if it does work. You're rolling much higher. So it could also be a bailout card. But also, like, if you just play it behind a taunt, and your opponent has 1 minion on the board or whatever, you may be losing 2 cards to 1, because he's not going to get through the taunt and be able to buff his minion to take out your Doomsayer, right? Like, your Doomsayer is killing everything on the board if you do that, right? Like, if you play, like, a Pompous Thespian with a Doomsayer on one turn, and your opponent has 1 minion on the board, you Doomsayered. Like, the board is getting destroyed. You have traded your 2 cards, which are both 2 mana, so you haven't lost that much card advantage, and you killed his, like, 5 or 6 drop. And, again, you've drained 6 of his mana. So you're going even on card advantage pretty much, even though it's 2 cards for 1 card, it's 2 small cards for 1 big card. And you've totally flipped the board. Like, that's an insanely good result in the late game, where Doomsayer doesn't typically shine. Like, what you're afraid of is Doomsayer becomes a dead card because you eventually have the board, right? But in so many late game scenarios, especially in this, like, control matchup style, you can make Doomsayer into an insane tempo swing card.
Yeah, and recently, so you've gotten 12 wins with a Mage Doomsayer.
Yeah, like a control mage.
Right. I've gotten 12 wins with Doomsayer and Hunter. And this is also just because, like, so you're talking about gaining like 6 mana or perhaps even more in the late game. A lot of times with Hunter, you know, I have a choice of playing a turn 1, right? But I don't do it. And then they play their turn 2. I play Doomsayer. They pass their turn 3. And on my turn 3, you know, I just go, right? Like, that's when I go.
They have used 6 mana to do what your 3 mana has done in your skip turn and Doomsayer. So they're 3 mana behind now. Like, in the early game, in which you're capped out at 3 mana. They're already 3 mana behind you.
Right. And I think the snowball analogy is great here, because snowballs, if you start with a bigger snowball, it snowballs faster, right? And I'm able to, like, on turn 3, then play, like, all my stuff, or just ensure that I have, like, an empty board Vicious Fledgling, right? Which is really, really freaking great. So I think Doomsayer has, it's really just, like, surprised me. And then when I really think about it, I was like, oh, yeah, it's like, of course it should be good. It's the power level of the cards is increased, but it's really shifted away from the zombie chows and the ridiculous early game plays, right?
So if Doomsayer is so good, why is it only a 90? It's like below average.
Yeah, it still is below average. And part of the reason is just because when you are sort of even on the board, or if you're ahead on the board, you don't really care, especially if you're like super ahead, right? But it's for those times in which you're like even on the board and you have a card that is dead. Like you just can't play it, right? You just can't play because you're still fighting for the board, and you can still try a set of situations, but at the same time, if you're kind of even, you're playing for that card advantage, it's really, really bad. And at the end of the day, our tier list, is an average, right? So I love Doomsayer, but I'm still not gonna say it's like
it's worse right now than a 3/2. It's worse right now than a 3/2 because if your opponent does nothing, like most mages do, or a rogue, which is hero power, and that's like plenty of your matchups. And sometimes a paladin would play like some cards, but sometimes not. You can't Doomsayer. I mean, you can, but you're not doing much. You've spent one card to trade even mana, right?
Right.
And if you had a 3/2, you'd be ahead on the board. Like, that's a pretty big loss right there. And then, of course, there's the loss of when you're actually ahead on the board. This is an unplayable card. Whereas a 3/2 can help you keep the pressure up on the tempo. So it also, something that's going to be factored in really negatively from our perspective is the RNG aspect, right? Like, if your opponent does have something like a buff,
Crazed Owl, Kooky Chemist.
or Crazed Owl, Kooky Chemist, anything like that, it's dead. And not only is it dead, but you've probably anti-templed to play it if it's any turn besides turn 2, because you're like, oh, he can't kill it. But so now he can kill it, so you're even more behind. Like, you expected a tempo swing of +6 to your favor, but instead you got like a -3 tempo swing against you. Probably higher than that if he kills the Doomsayer for free. Like, and that means you lose, right? You just lose the game right there.
So I will say because if you look at the Lightforge tier list, some of the averages of cards won't move that much just because they're very sort of like standalone cards, right? Doomsayer is one in which, if you were to track sort of what value it would have depending on the deck, this is one that would move quite a bit, right? Depending on sort of how your deck plays out and kind of what cards you already have. So this is like, I think, our average score, but it is by no means sort of the score when you get to pick number 15, 20, or 25.
Yep. All right. Well, that's it from us. Do you have anything to add?
No, that is about it. We're about to play our run, and so I might be jinxing it, but we've been doing decently so far. Hopefully, we'll have another good run.
Another good run, this time with Hunter again. All right. Well, that's it from the Lightforge. We'll see you next week. Until then, this is ADWCTA.
This is Merps. Bye-bye.
Kate.
Okay.
Oh my god, it's so hot. It's Hunter.